The history of Memorial Day. This is excerpted from Reverend Don Cooley. It has been reported that Memorial Day was started by former slaves on May 1, 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina to honor 257 dead Union soldiers who had been buried in a mass grave in a Confederate prison camp. They dug up the bodies and worked for 2 weeks to give them a proper burial as gratitude for fighting for their freedom. They held a parade of 10,000 people led by 2,800 black children where they marched, sang, and celebrated. They sang songs including John Brown's Body and the Star-Spangled Banner. As most of us have learned the hard way, just because something is circulating on the internet doesn't make it true. So is this story accurate? The answer is mixed. On the one hand, these events did happen. On the other, there is dispute as to whether this is the origin of Memorial Day. Well, there would be a dispute, wouldn't there? I mean, what white male in power wants to attribute such a powerful day to a bunch of former slaves? Memorial Day marks the unofficial start of summer, conjuring images of picnics, barbecues, or just a lazy day off. But originally, the holiday was charged with deeper meaning. The exact origins of Memorial Day are disputed, with at least 5 towns claiming to have given birth to the holiday sometime near the end of the Civil War. Yale University historian David Blight places the first Memorial Day in April 1865, when a group of former slaves gathered at a Charleston, South Carolina horse track turned Confederate prison where more than 250 Union soldiers had died. Digging up the soldiers' mass grave, they interred the bodies in individual graves, built a 100-yard fence around them, and erected an archway over the entrance bearing the words, "Martyrs of the Racecourse." On May 1, 1865, some 10,000 black Charleston residents, white missionaries, teachers, school children, and Union troops marched around the Planters' Racecourse, singing and carrying an armful of roses. Gathering in the graveyard, the crowd watched 5 black preachers recite scripture and a children's choir sing spirituals. Some historians consider the gathering the first Memorial Day. It took 3 more years for the holiday to become widely observed. General John A. Logan of the Grand Army of the Republic proclaimed that May 30th, 1868 would be Decoration Day, which was, quote, designated for the purpose of strewing with flowers or otherwise decorating the graves of comrades who died in the defense of their country during the late rebellion, end quote. On Decoration Day that year, General James Garfield gave a speech at Arlington National Cemetery. Afterward, over 5,000 observers decorated the graves of more than 20,000 Union and Confederate soldiers. Memorial Day was so closely linked with the Union cause that many Southern states refused to celebrate it. This changed after World War I, when the holiday was expanded beyond honoring fallen Civil War soldiers to recognize Americans who had died fighting in all wars. It was also renamed Memorial Day. Over time, the original focus on, as Frederick Douglass put it, the moral clash between, quote, slavery and freedom, barbarism and civilization, end quote, may have been lost. With the National Holiday Act of 1971, Congress moved Memorial Day from May 30th to the last Monday in May. By making the holiday part of a 3-day weekend that promotes relaxation, loses the intent of the holiday's true meaning. In 1989, Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii introduced a bill to move the holiday back to the fixed date of May 30th. He has reintroduced it in every Congress, but with no success.
So this is a reading about Abraham Lincoln. So we think about Memorial Day, we don't necessarily think about Abraham Lincoln. However, he was a very central part of all these activities that were the origin of Memorial Day. I wrote this reading from many sources. A good deal of the reading today is material used with permission from Dr. Heather Richardson from her Letters from an American on February 12, 2022. I also got information from the Journal American Abraham Lincoln Association, Civil War and Lincoln encyclopedias, citations and lectures, books on Lincoln, and various history websites. There is quite a bit of material. So let me just start to say, the Civil War was horrible, period. Even if it was for a cause that UUs believe in and have somewhat encapsulated in our UU principles, this war pitted brothers against brothers, cousins against cousins, family against family. 620,000 died in battle. So we think about our COVID numbers. Compare that number to the highest loss of American soldiers, the next highest loss, and that was in World War II of 450,000 souls, and in World War I, 117,000 souls. And for every three soldiers who fell in battle in the Civil War, 5 more died of disease. So the true total is likely as large as 1.5 million. The battles raged across 20+ states, several Indian territories, and were fought from April 1861 to April 1865, across 4 Aprils. Many famous Unitarians were ardent abolitionists, including Julia Howe, who wrote the lyrics to the battle hymn of the Republic we just sang, and many Unitarians supported the Civil War to end slavery. Many hundreds, maybe thousands of unknown Unitarians were also abolitionists and staunch supporters of the Civil War. From Dr. Richardson, I have an excerpt here that starts with, on February 12, 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born. Lincoln was the nation's 16th president, leading from March 1861 until his assassination, 1865, a little over a month into his second term. He piloted the country through the Civil War, preserving the concept of American democracy. It was a system had never been fully realized, but he still saw that the last best hope of earth to prove that people could govern themselves. But in Lincoln's day, fabulously wealthy enslavers had gained control over the government and begun to argue that the founders had gotten their worldview terribly wrong. They insisted their system of human enslavement, which had enabled them to amass fortunes previously unimaginable, was the right one. Most men were dull drudges who must be led by their betters for their own good, Southern leaders said. As South Carolina Senator and enslaver James Henry Hammond put it, I repudiate as ridiculous the much lauded but nowhere credited dogma of Mr. Jefferson, that all men are created equal. In the 1850s, on a fragment of paper, Lincoln figured out the logic of a world that permitted the law to sort people into different places in a hierarchy, applying the reasoning he heard around him. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, why not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? Lincoln wrote, you say A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker? Take care. By this rule, you're to be slave to the first man you meet with fairer skin than your own. You do not mean color exactly? You mean the whites are intellectually superiors to the blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them? Take care again. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But, you say, it is a question of interest, and if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. If he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. This is in the 1850s. Lincoln saw clearly that if we give up the principle of equality before law, we have given up the whole game. We've admitted the principle that people are unequal and that some people are better than others. Once we've replaced the principle of equality with the idea that humans are unequal, we have granted approval to the idea of rulers and ruled. At that point, all any of us can do is hope that no one in power decides that we belong in one of the lesser groups. So, I thought to myself, this was a great man. But I was reminded that Lincoln's legacy did not benefit Native Americans, and in fact was a horrible time for Native Americans in America. Lincoln signed both the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. Both of these acts did immeasurable harm to the Native Americans who found their ancestral homes overrun by westward expansion, further enabled by transcontinental radios. This we learned in detail in the UUFB book study of the indigenous history of the United States. I searched to learn more about this sad legacy and try to personally reconcile the good and bad in this great but flawed president, as we did in our president's service with several presidents in February this year. What is interesting is that Lincoln likely had more contact with Native Americans than he did with black slaves. He grew up in what was then the frontier in Illinois amongst the ongoing struggle for security along the frontier. He enlisted in the militia as a young man in the Black Hawk War, which pitted the militia against Native American aggressors. He never fought in a battle, but was witness to the bloody aftermath. However, upon his reenlistment, he was assigned to a group that worked, lived, and even played sports with several Native tribes, American Native tribes, who were allies. He was a great sportsman, loved wrestling and running, so he really was, he apparently had a great time. During this period, Lincoln was said to have developed and expressed respect for the Native tribes. From the analyses I've read, Lincoln viewed Native Americans as simultaneously respectable. They were cohesive societies in contrast to any black slave he may have met, and they were foreign because Native American tribes, language, custom, and hierarchy were hard to understand, hence foreign. But Lincoln also strongly supported westward expansion, as did most Americans at that time. As he entered politics, his speeches contained words that reflect the desire for westward expansion and American superiority. In his speech in 1859, Lincoln described all the resources that are available to the American people, such as textiles from Europe, buffalo hide from the Rockies, sugar from Louisiana, agricultural goods from the tropics, and whale oil from the Pacific. He mentioned the railroad and electricity as technologies available for American ingenuity and public service. However, when he discussed the origins of these resources, Lincoln said, "The American owns a large part of the world by right of possessing it, and all the rest by right of wanting it and intending to have it." He further clarified his views in 1860 when he explained that American habits of observation, innovation, and experimentation separated them from natives and Europeans. According to Lincoln, Spaniards, Mexicans, and Native Americans, and you notice the grouping, Native Americans were grouped with the Mexicans and the Spaniards, but those folks in California had been living and working in a region with rich gold deposits, but had never noticed them until American observers probed the area. In Lincoln's view, it's the cultural habits of American investigation that led to the discovery of California gold and other Western resources that justified Americans' claims to possession of those regions. Lincoln viewed the Native American presence in the West as a foreign one that would eventually be overcome. One of the most cited atrocities attributed to Lincoln was the execution of 38 Santee Indians, also called Dakota and Sioux, in December 1862. The U.S. Army prepared to execute 303 Sioux, or Santee, that had attacked white settlements with extreme ferocity previous August and September in Minnesota. The military required Lincoln to review the evidence personally due to the number of people accused. Lincoln looked at all the files and found cause to commute the sentences of 264 individuals, and one condemned to hang was granted a reprieve. The other 38 warriors were hung on December 26 in what was and remains the largest mass execution and the largest act of executive clemency in American history. This clemency, should be noted, was extremely unpopular at the time. It has also been noted that Lincoln never ordered the execution of Confederate generals or other soldiers at the end of the Civil War. And Lincoln also personally intervened to save a solo Native warrior who came into the camp in peace with papers during the Black Hawk War. So, perhaps when faced with individuals, the actual humans, he recognized their humanity. Perhaps when he considered at a distance the foreign nations of Native Americans and Europeans and Mexicans, etc., they are all faceless others. And though not necessarily dehumanized, they were not given the consideration that we all wish he had. By the way, a mere 5 days after the execution of the Dakota 38, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
Hi, I'm Darla Timmons. I served in the military Army during the Vietnam era, 3 years, and then I did 7 years in the 420th MP Company here in Bozeman. I am going to read the Gettysburg Address. Several states felt their soldiers deserved a better resting place than the original shallow graves on Gettysburg battlefield, Gettysburg citizen David Wills convinced Pennsylvania to purchase 17 acres of the battlefield to have the soldiers properly buried. A dedication ceremony was planned, and famed orator and former Harvard President Edward Everett was to be the featured speaker. President Lincoln was asked to speak as an afterthought and had only about 2 weeks to prepare his remarks. Apparently, 15,000 people were on hand to hear Everett's 2-hour speech, and Lincoln's 2-minute speech was over before most in the crowd realized he had even begun. Now let us hear the speech given by President Abraham Lincoln on December 19, 1863, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of the field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note or long remember what they say here, but it can never be forgot what they did here. It is for us the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
Good morning. I'm Bruce Swarny. I was a hospital corpsman in the Navy for 6 years. And I'm reading Taps by Erica A. Hewitt and Paul S. Sawyer. Think of where you feel safe and at peace. What's the signal that tells you it's okay to be at peace? For people in the United States military, there's a special signal that says you're okay and you're at peace. It's a melody called Taps, and it's only 24 notes long. It was composed by a general in the Civil War and his bugler. It's hard to remember how important bugle calls were in the military once upon a time. In the days before radio, bugle calls were the only way military units could communicate to groups over a large area. In the 1860s, the end of the day was important. If there was time and peace enough to play taps, that was a signal that the camp was relatively safe. It meant you were not under attack. It meant there were no enemy soldiers to worry about. To a camp of soldiers, the notes of taps meant that unless you were on duty, you could close your eyes and sleep in peace. They say that the first times taps was played at a service for fallen soldiers also took place during the Civil War. In those days, the traditional military salute was, as it still is, the firing of a 3-round volley of rifles. But this one time, they say, was after a long battle, when finally a ceasefire had been called and both sides had stopped to bury their dead. In one camp, as the work ended and the memorial service began to take shape, the soldiers knew that sounding the military salute might be taken as a return to fighting and not as a sacred memorial. Someone had the idea of sounding a bugle, and that sound would never be taken as an aggressive act of war. Taps came to mean the same thing. It meant the safe and quiet end to the day. Time to rest. Time to turn the lights out, to let their eyes close, and as best they could, to be at peace. Almost as soon as taps was sounded on a quiet night in July 1862, someone put words with the music. The words that accompany taps combine a soldier's sleep with a soldier's death in an exquisite melody and word combination that could offer some comfort to the grief-stricken families of their fallen heroes. It is for that reason that we offer the words to that haunting 24-note evening bugle call that has become synonymous with laying a hero to rest. That's what taps means. It's like a powerful prayer. We try to make our fellowship a place where people can feel safe and at peace. We work outside of these walls to create a community like that too, a world where everyone feels at peace in their neighborhoods and towns. This weekend, many people in the U.S. are remembering and honoring all the fallen soldiers who have died while serving in our military. Sienna will play it twice for us now, and the words for the 2 verses are in the bulletin. Oh, sorry, she'll play it 3 times. As we listen and sing, think of every soldier who might have been afraid, and then let taps remind you that they are now at peace.
So here's the poem, In Flanders Field by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing fly, scarce heard among the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders field. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, to be yours to hold high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field.